Good evening. I don't know why I always end up wearing dresses when I know I'm going to be mic'd up. I had the experience of being 8 months pregnant and someone running cables through my dress in a Sky News studio not too long ago. But it's such a pleasure to be here. It's been great to meet some of you already. I'll just start by saying a couple of things, and it'll just be a couple of things about UNA UK, just so you have a bit of a better idea what we do. We exist to make the case for an effective United Nations, and the word effective is really important here, to policymakers and the public. In practice, this means that sometimes we're UN cheerleaders. So we explain what it does, why it matters, why governments should support it. But it also means that we are sometimes a UN watchdog. So we do a lot of work in terms of monitoring its performance, calling it out when it isn't living up to expectations, and crucially trying to generate some ideas on how to make it work better. So I'm in the market for some ideas from you all today. And I'm going to give you an example of one of our reform initiatives a bit later. But first, I just want to say thank you to the British Council for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to meet you all. Usually when I'm invited to speak to an influential audience, I'm sort of looking out on a sea of grey hair. I'm sure you hear this all the time. Young people are the future, you're future leaders, future decision makers. You're very, very, very important, but so often you're not actually in the room when decisions are being made. I was just reading up a little bit on youth representation on my way here. Fewer than 6% of parliamentarians are under 30. 2 out of 3 countries do not consult young people. We've just heard universities don't always consult young people either on national policies. And I have worked on some of the UK government consultations with young people, and quite frankly, they've been very limited and kind of just a tick box exercise. And I definitely don't want to dismiss the wonderful name of this program, because this program sounds brilliant, but I don't think you're future leaders, you are current leaders. Because what we need is action now. We don't need solutions to global challenges at some distant point in the future. You need to be working on them right now. So I see it as a privilege to be here. And I'm going to do my best to give you a little bit of food for thought. I'm going to make you work a little bit as well. Because I was reading your profiles before this session, and I see that quite a few of you have worked for or with the United Nations in some capacity. So I'm not going to give you my usual spiel about why the UN is still relevant. You're also going to hear from some people who are much better placed than I am to tell you about that later on in the coming days, I understand. So I just want to have maybe a little show of hands to begin with. Who in this room thinks the UN is still relevant? And who does not? That's better than I thought, actually. This is the question that I'm usually asked to answer. Every time I'm asked to give a talk, apart from this one, actually, which is very refreshing, or an interview, it's all about, is the UN still relevant? Is it still a talking shop? Does it still matter? And I actually don't think that's the right question. To me, and I think probably to you, it's abundantly clear that the problems we face require global solutions. The line between international and national interests is fading every day. I think that's very clear when we're talking about problems like climate change and extremism and pandemics, but I think it's also more and more the case with traditionally domestic issues like job creation and energy access. You look at the Hinkley Point nuclear plant that's going to be built in this country, create about 25,000 jobs done with Chinese investment. So we really don't have the luxury anymore of saying what happens over there doesn't matter to me. When the flooding happened in South Asia early this year, we're talking about the kind of global repercussions that might be felt. You know, a flood in Bangladesh could lead to prices of rice going up in Nigeria. It could lead to disruption in the global garment supply chain, affecting the livelihoods of people all around the world. So we really are interconnected. And I think if you take the long-term view of any of these so-called domestic challenges, demographics, migration, etc., it's really clear that we need global solutions. And we need an organization that can facilitate those solutions. We need an organization that can help countries to share the burden and reap the benefits. We need an organization that can look beyond short-term election cycles. We need an organization that can support, advise, and cajole countries into acting. And we need an organization that can help us manage the huge range of cross-border threats and emergencies that are taking place right now, and that can step into the breach when countries aren't getting their act together. That's what we need. What we have is the United Nations. It's 70 years old. It doesn't reflect today's global power dynamics. It's horrendously overstretched, underfunded, and bureaucratic, and it often fails. But it has the potential to deliver what we need. And I'm going to be frank here, it's what we have, and we're not going to get anything better anytime soon. Regional organizations, groups like the G20, big NGOs, they've shown that they can often work more effectively than the UN on certain issues. But the UN is still the only organization that has the reach and the remit to at least try to tackle the spectrum of challenges we face and to do so holistically. Its broad membership gives it a legitimacy that's hard to replicate, and it tackles problems that others just won't or can't. It took 2 world wars to create the UN. Right now, principled political leadership is in short supply, and I just can't see us doing any better. In fact, the opposite. There's a real risk that those in power are keen to undermine what we have. So I think instead of constantly asking, is the UN so relevant, do we need it, we should be focusing on how to make it work better. Someone told me a story a couple of years ago, and it really stuck with me, about a 3-year-old girl in South Sudan who walked for days with her blind father to reach a UN response center. She'd heard the UN was there, her father had heard, and they sort of muddled through and walked for days because they thought the UN is here, that means we'll be able to get food, we'll be able to get medicine. And they were right. And that story really stuck with me because for all its flaws, the UN still is that symbol of hope and a vital lifeline for so many people, and often the only one they have. So I'm going to say a little bit now about UN decision-making. I'm going to set out 4 challenges to securing good outcomes, and hopefully end on a positive note with a couple of examples of when decision-making did work. The Paris Climate Agreement and a campaign that UNA UK worked on called 1 for 7 billion, which tried to open up the process for the UN Secretary General. So let's start with UN decision-making. Over the years, the UN's agenda has expanded to include pretty much anything you can think of. States' knee-jerk reaction seems to be, there's a problem there, let's create a UN agency to deal with it. So now we have over 30 funds, programs, and agencies, more than 1,000 offices, and just a dizzying array of processes and procedures. The Secretary General himself, Antonio Guterres, is very fond of saying that if there was this conspiracy to undermine the UN, they couldn't have come up with a better set of rules than the current ones that are in place. So decisions are made in a variety of ways. Each UN body has a different way of making its decisions. Sometimes even a specific meeting or a specific issue will have its own rules. In as far as there is a common formula, it's a vote of all members with a simple majority that rises usually to 2/3 if it's a sort of particularly tricky issue. But there are many exceptions. The veto of the permanent members, the P5 of the Security Council, is probably the most high profile. But you've also got things like the Conference on Disarmament, which work by consensus. So basically, every member state in the Conference on Disarmament has a veto. So you're starting to see why sometimes things don't go to plan. For that reason, decisions are often pre-negotiated, so that, on the day itself, world leaders can simply come, smile for the camera, sign on the dotted line, because the hard work has already been done. So why don't things go to plan? Why don't we think the UN is working? I'm particularly interested in those of you who thought the UN is passé, but others as well. I'd love to hear from you. What was your impression and your experience of why the UN isn't living up to its expectations?
So I think one of my major concerns with the UN, and there was a statement you said its broad legitimacy its broad membership gives it legitimacy that other organizations don't. But does it? If only 5 countries in the Security Council have the power to make decisions for the entire 193 countries in the UN. So my question really is, what steps have been taken to reform the Security Council to make it more reflective and representative of our world? Because I think it's unfair that Africa doesn't have
a permanent seat on the Security Council. And every day, decisions are taken in the UN that have implications for our continent. So I think, it's the changing the power dynamics to make it more reflective of our world today. It's a starting point for people to actually feel that the UN has the power to, solve problems in their societies.
That's a great question. I want to take a few more comments before I come to that. It's a tricky one as well to start with.
Hello, I actually interned for the UNDP in West Africa, and my question relates back to my experience, as I noticed that there's a sustainability problem in terms of the specific projects that the UNDP conducts in several parts of the world. These projects, when they are implemented, they bring a lot of promise and a lot of hope for the beneficiaries of these projects. In my case, it was rural women in rural parts of West Africa. But then, once the project is implemented, there's obviously a monitoring and evaluation phase. But once that phase is over, it's almost like that momentary dream or that momentary vision of success, of finding a solution to a certain problem is basically dead. And so what is being done by the United Nations to ensure that the impact of these projects can last and can sustain itself by itself?
Wow, these are huge questions already. I'm just going to take maybe one more then and then try and answer them. Or just stick with those two. Well, maybe I'll just delve in there then with Security Council reform. My point on legitimacy was a broad one. It's basically the idea that the UN can be the last line in a chain of approval to give something a global seal. So, for example, it would be great to have a regional climate agreement, but it's better to have a global climate agreement. A regional human rights treaty is effective in that region, but if something becomes global and universal and all states have become part of it, that's something quite unique that only the UN can confer. And the fact that you have a chamber, General Assembly, where all UN member states, rich, poor, big and small, have one vote, that is important. You get decisions that aren't binding, but they reflect world opinion. And you can see that over time, things change and move in a positive direction on, say, the death penalty, for example. One thing I found really interesting that, you're right, the P5 do have that power and that stranglehold over so many parts of the system. But they do need the support of other states to get things done. It's just sheer numbers. They can't continue to ignore and not canvass when they need a certain number of votes in the General Assembly and even in the Security Council. Yes, a veto can wreck it all, but you still need 9 votes out of 15 in favor. So there's a sense to which these countries do pay attention. And the example I'll give you later on about our Secretary General selection process, to me was a real eye-opener when I didn't think, why would anyone, any of the P5 want to give up a little bit of power over a very important decision who heads the UN? But they did, because they know that it's not just about that one decision or using the veto on one occasion. They calibrate everything they do in the context of all of their bilateral and multilateral relations. So it does plug in to that. So there are wider concerns, even for them. I know that the UK, which often feels under pressure for its seat as its global power sort of fades, and possibly more so in the next few years, is very aware of being a representative for the wider UN membership on the Council. That doesn't always translate into positive action, but they're aware of it. In terms of what's being done, nothing. I mean, really, Security Council reform, I don't think will happen in my lifetime. I don't know if it'll happen in the lifetime of my baby who's 9 months. And the reason for that is, well, I think if there was one formula of reform every region agreed on, we'd have something quite powerful, and then you could put pressure on the P5. But we don't. Nigeria doesn't want South Africa to be on it. Brazil doesn't want Argentina, Germany, Italy. There's always a regional power that doesn't want the other power to get on, and you don't have a formula. And of course, the permanent members, they're in no rush. They're usually the ones who push for change and are able to make things happen, but they're pretty happy to just sit back. What I will say, though, is I'm not sure that if the Council of the composition changed, we would get better outcomes necessarily. I think there's a reason why the Security Council is the way it is, and that's because, you know, the founders of the UN tried to learn from the previous mistake, you know, in the League of Nations, where big powers could simply walk away. So it's a bargain. It's a pragmatic bargain. You give special privilege to the most powerful, so that they continue to play ball. Now, you can argue about whether they are still the most powerful. What I do think they still are is the most willing, for better or worse, to feel like they have a role to play internationally. And I think that's the problem. So hopefully, if there is a formula that everyone can coalesce around, I really hope that happens and we'll get some change, but I'm not sure. In terms of sustainability, I might again say something a little bit controversial. I think the UN is slowly getting the fact that it can't do it all, and it's not, and it shouldn't be doing it all. You have this constant mantra that the Sustainable Development Goals, the Climate Treaty, the actual work needs to be done by national and local actors if it is going to be sustainable. Not just for the country, which is the most important thing, but actually for the UN itself. The UN is doing so many different things, and it's totally overstretched. And in my view, it should be stepping back from development and focusing more on the things that aren't easy to replicate. You know, international negotiations, convening people, mediation, you know, the political work that's harder for others to do. And really just let others step away. And that's what I said before. It's annoying that states always think like the answer to every problem is another UN agency or a coordination mechanism or an inquiry mechanism, without just saying, no, others can do this work better now. The UN should build capacity and then leave and let a sustainable project grow. I think we're starting to see signs of that in some of the reforms by the new Secretary General. It's going to be a long process, going to be horrendous, because there's so many vested interests in all of the agencies. But there you go. Wow, those were two really difficult questions to start with. Let me just run through very quickly the reasons why I think the UN often doesn't come to good outcomes. We've touched on some of these already. The first is what I call the UN's built-in catch, the fact that it's made of member states. It's countries ultimately who call all the shots. They're the ones who agree the UN's budget. They agree its agenda. They decide if it does or doesn't do something. They appoint all of its senior officials, and actually sometimes even lower down. There's all sorts of little vested interest in posts. I was talking to colleagues in New York last week about the difficulty they're having at the moment in getting states to agree that more UN communications officials work on social media and not on radio. You know, I mean, this is a question of moving maybe 20 posts, and it's taking months and months and months, and there's just no end in sight. So I think often when we hear about the UN's failures, they're the failures of states, and we try to make a distinction between when it's UN officials that have been sadly corrupt or you know, or not living up to expectations, and when it's governments who've been doing so. And on the big things, it generally is governments. I think the sad fact is when the P5 don't agree, if they have vested interests, as they had very tragically in Syria and so many other parts of the world, or actually when they're not interested enough in a particular issue. So a lot of big powers weren't that interested at the beginning of the Ebola outbreak, and then you saw a sluggishness, a lack of response. So I think it's very difficult for the UN then to make progress. That's one issue. The second is, again, we've touched on this, the sort of democratic deficit, not just in terms of states, but actually also in terms of other actors. I think it's terrible that UN officials and states keep saying, oh, it's other actors who need to take forward the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change, when actually these actors don't have a role at all in formal governance. You have companies who now have wider spheres of influence than many states. You've got civil society movements that can mobilize millions of people. I think it was more than 20 years ago, probably even longer now, that Secretary General Boutros-Ghali said CNN was the 16th member of the Security Council. But we haven't really moved on in those sort of 20, 25 years structurally. So I think that's something that really, really needs to change. Then there's what I will call the solidarity deficit, and that plays in a little bit into the first question. I think the UN has delivered a lot for the poor and for developing countries. I think people in those countries, including my own, are often much more aware of the UN's work than maybe people in this country where, well, what's it here for? But I would argue that Western states have gained a lot more from the post-1945 system. It favors them in structure, it favors them in approach. International agreements have allowed trade to flourish, and humanitarian assistance, while it's maybe helping people in the global south, has actually insulated the West from crises. So wars occur elsewhere. And I think now we're seeing that system come under strain, and suddenly people are waking up, oh, lots of refugees are coming to Europe. Why is this happening? Well, actually, developing countries have been hosting and still host the vast majority of refugees. I think it's strange that, all of a sudden we're looking at more permanent solutions for refugees because this problem is now affecting richer countries more. Another story I heard was of a lady called Halima who walked from Somalia into the Kenyan Dadaab camp, one of the biggest refugee camps, sort of winding down now a bit more. But she walked there with her little daughter and stayed. And 25 years later, last year, her granddaughter gives birth to her fourth child. So you have 4 generations in a family who've just lived in a refugee camp, 2 who've never known anything else. And yet we're still persisting with these sort of makeshift stopgap solutions. And only now, when it's affecting other countries, particularly countries in the West, are we talking about a migration compact and doing more. So even though I think there's lots of good examples of cross-regional working, things are getting better in that way at the UN, the North-South dynamic still continues to be a challenge, and rightly so. And the example I'm going to talk about later on the climate agreement is one of the processes that really was delayed for a long time because of that dynamic. And finally, there's a sort of misdiagnosis, I think, of the real problem. When it comes to the lack of Security Council effectiveness and representation, when it comes to the UN's tragic failure to halt mass atrocities in Srebrenica, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, there's no shortage of ideas on how to overcome these. I don't think it's because we lack the ideas that nothing is happening. I'm not saying that these ideas in UN reform isn't important. It's part of my job, and I want to hear your ideas. But I think we're kidding ourselves if the Security Council, membership or I think some little clever procedural tweak with the veto is going to make things better automatically. I don't think there is any magic reform that's going to make up for a lack of political will. So I think, we spend a lot of our time and energy on those proposals, and we don't spend enough time simply just telling our governments, you need to do a better job. And that's especially relevant to those of us who are in the UK. I might have been a bit gloomy now, so I'm just going to end with a couple of examples of UN processes that worked. First, the Paris Climate Agreement, which was adopted a mere 23 years after the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change decided that it should take action to prevent dangerous interference with the climate system. So that was agreed in 1992. It took 2 years after that to enter into force. It took another 3 years for the Kyoto Protocol, which included binding targets for some countries, to be agreed, and then another 8 years for that to enter into force. And the protocol wasn't all bad. It did support some emissions reductions, but it was pretty much hamstrung from the outset. The US didn't ratify it. Major emerging economies who argued rightly that they didn't have really historical responsibility for emissions were exempt from targets. Canada later withdrew. And when the discussions about a successor to the Kyoto Protocol started in 2005, it basically marked kind of a lost decade for climate negotiations. Japan, New Zealand, and Russia just said from the outset, no, we're not going to take on further commitments. The US said, no, we're not going to do it unless the major emerging economies do it. So everything sort of limped along until about 2012, when an extension was eventually agreed, but it only involved countries that produced about 15% of global emissions. So it was very limited in value. So the hopes for this sort of big universal binding treaty were pretty much just dead by then. And the UN and some supportive governments decided to change tack. So they decided to scrap the idea of a universal treaty and focus instead on an ambitious goal and trying to secure buy-in through non-binding, self-defined commitments. Now, we and other campaigners were initially quite skeptical about this, but I think it became clear quite quickly that this approach could bear fruit. So the two-track process was replaced in 2011 in Durban by a universal process that for the first time involved all countries going down a route of making some commitments. major players appeared to be working towards a deal. In 2014, it was great that China and the US announced their commitments. India actually came up with a sort of review process for how these could be verified. So it looked like things were sort of buzzing along. When it came to Paris, of course, I think success was still pretty much not guaranteed. I think a lot of people, watched the reports of cheers, but actually everyone I know who was there said it was just relief. It was just sheer relief that this had happened, and it was 2 incredibly hard weeks of negotiation. Lots of world leaders who were, supportive of the deal, François Hollande and Barack Obama sort of repeatedly were just calling other heads of state, saying we need to make this happen. I've said a lot about how procedural tweaks won't work, but actually it was quite interesting that there were a mix of tools that the French used, building on what was used by Mexico and South Africa at their conferences, that helped shape the agreement. So there was something called confessionals. So there were sort of confidential places where delegates could speak privately and freely. There were informal informals, one lovely UN jargon, where small groups of countries could kind of iron out specific parts of the text. And there were indabas, so groups of delegates who met from different parts of the world to kind of iron out the remaining sort of areas of disagreement. There was also a coalition of high ambition by small developing states, which really helped to kind of keep the momentum going and not to lose sight of some of the more ambitious targets, particularly on limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So that mention is down to that coalition. So we got a deal. And it's not perfect, but it has the potential to develop into something important. And I think what was really inspiring was to see it withstand the test of the US announcing its potential withdrawal. I think the response from within America and the response from outside was really, really wonderful. And something, a rare moment of something really encouraging. And last of all, I want to give you an example of how a tiny NGO, we've only got 6 members of staff like UNA UK, can influence decision-making. So about 3 years ago, we decided, because other reform initiatives weren't really happening, what is one change that we could push for that might have an impact across the board? And as I think is befitting for the Future Leaders Connect program, it was leadership. Good leadership was needed at the UN. And we thought good leadership depends on a process that isn't the P5 just getting together, huddling in a little room and saying, we want that person because they're not going to rock the boat. So we looked at the appointment process, and the charter is actually really the UN's constitutional document. The charter is really vague. It says the appointment will be made by the General Assembly on the recommendation of the Security Council. Of course, we know what that means. It means the P5 rule the roost. And we felt that this symbolized so much of what was wrong with the UN, as we heard in the first question, 5 countries controlling a decision that affects 7 billion people. So we created something called the 1 for 7 billion campaign. Few people thought that we'd managed to succeed in reforming a process that had defied reform for 70 years. We also met a lot of people who said no one in the real world is going to be interested in a UN recruitment process. But, I think people get it. If you've ever had, if you've ever applied for a job and someone told you there's no timetable, there's no criteria, and actually there's just 5 of our board members are going to pick someone who's going to be nice to them, everyone realizes that is not a good process to have. So we were able to build a coalition of 750 NGOs and 200 million supporters, and crucially, a vast majority of states. We secured a number of reforms, all the things I just mentioned, timeline, selection criteria, a public list of candidates, and I think the most important reform we secured was public dialogue. So candidates had to present to the whole UN membership, not just behind closed doors to the P5, in sessions that were webcast and included questions from civil society. And we actually hosted a couple of events with candidates as well. This was a huge change. It doesn't sound like much to actually have a timeline and a couple of sessions with candidates. But if you think about when Mr. Ban, the former Secretary General, was appointed, even some of the countries who were on the Security Council but who weren't the permanent members, they had no idea that he was even running. They didn't even know. They were supposed to make the decision. It was just foisted upon them as a sort of fait accompli. So we came a long way, and I think the dialogues, even now, people say were pretty much what changed the fortunes for Mr. Guterres. He wasn't considered a front runner. There was a big push to have the first female head the UN, which would have been nice. And there was an expectation that it was Eastern Europe's turn to hold the post. But Guterres' strong performance in the dialogue meant he built up momentum. Samantha Power, the former US ambassador, actually described it as his breakthrough moment. So even though certain states might have preferred other candidates, he became the consensus of this is actually quite a decent person for this job. We did a lot of thinking about why we were successful. I think it's because we started early. Things don't happen quickly at the UN. Previous reform processes started with about 6 months or so to go. We started with 3 years. I think we captured the mood. Other reform processes were going nowhere. And I think a lot of states saw this as an opportunity to, quite frankly, stick it to the P5 and say, look, we are going to reclaim something and show that we still matter. We want to say in this decision. We worked with states to translate all these wonderful speeches they've been giving year on year that were super vague about how the process could be better. We translated them into very sort of small, practical steps that didn't require formal reform. So a decision to webcast and thus make public the dialogue, obviously there's nothing in the UN Charter or Rules of Processes about that. So what we did is we went to the President of the General Assembly and said, hey, wouldn't this be a good idea? You don't have to ask anyone for permission, you can just do it. So we got a broad, sweeping resolution that said, wouldn't it be nice to have a process? Let the President of the General Assembly basically craft that process. We also got support from a Security Council member. We needed to have support from within. And we managed to lobby the British ambassador before he took up his post. So much of what happens at the UN is down to personalities about this. And we told him it was a great opportunity to get one over France, which sadly is how a lot of British foreign policy works. France at the time was attracting quite a lot of attention because it had an initiative on veto restraint. The UK was in the market for ideas. This was an idea that was very much in line with UK values of transparency, etc. And also, it gave the UK the opportunity to present itself as a champion for reform without actually giving up any of its power. The decision was still going to be rest with the Security Council. But of course, the fact that we had this open process did influence the P5's decision. There was basically a standoff between the US and the Russian preferred candidates. And then it was pretty obvious who else is going to fill the role. Well, the guy who did really well in the dialogues. And I think what it did was it raised the cost to the P5 of making a bad decision. I think it would have, if they'd really picked the dud, that would have been quite obvious. So I think our aim was always, let's not have the worst possible person and try to get the best possible person under the circumstances. And I think that's quite a neat illustration of the politics of pragmatism when it comes to UN decision making. And indeed, the UN itself, we always focus on its big aims and why it isn't living up to them. But I think its founders really did weigh the downsides of compromise against the heavy cost of war. And as I said before, they tried to give special privileges to the big powers to avoid the UN going the way of the League of Nations. The UN has endured 70 years. That in itself is pretty remarkable to me. And for all its flaws, I think it's going to continue to be an important actor in the future. And I think that means we all have our work cut out for us to help it work better. I'm going to leave it at that. I think we can overrun a little bit, and I hope there are more questions. Questions, comments, ideas, please.
Actually, I'm just going to speak loud. You said how the UN is trying to incorporate NGOs and other third sector, let's say, organizations. And I was actually wondering, how is the UN trying to incorporate the whole technology sector or the big players like Google, Facebook, Amazon, whatnot? Because now they're basically major players. And how is it working out this new geopolitical map of internet? And we're still thinking in a purely Westphalian state entities, I guess, at this point. And is the UN really taking any steps into mapping out this new General Assembly full of other actors that are not specifically states? Perhaps they don't have populations, or, well, a certain way, they might have robot populations, but are they mapping out any type of, reform in that sense, for technological actors, other actors that might be very influential in the world? So that's the question.
Yes and no. I think on the delivery side, there are lots and lots of great partnerships, including actually with Google and Amazon, etc. So there's a great project that Google's running, which is connecting victims of extremism and former extremists. That's part of the sort of UN's work of tolerance and fostering understanding, etc. There's a new SDGs app, which allows people to basically monitor and give feedback relating to actually the question on UNDP, on how the delivery is going, give some input into the services. I think there is a real recognition that the UN cannot do this, that states can't do this, and the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals and a lot of other elements of the UN's work needs to be done by NGOs. I think and I hope that some of the reforms that are being discussed on the development side at the moment will lead effectively to a huge transfer in knowledge, expertise, money, and maybe even staff from the UN into other sectors, and then have the UN effectively fade away from those sectors and people take steps forward. In terms of governance and in a seat at the table, I really don't think much is happening at all. We are trying to push the boundaries a little bit. There was a competition a couple of months ago to redesign the global governance system. And our proposal was to have a four-way governance structure where you have states, private sector, civil society, and young people who come from any of those three sectors, all sit at the table in terms of decision making. There are examples for that. The International Labour Organization, one of the oldest UN agencies, has a tripartite decision making of industry and workers, as it was called then, alongside states. But I don't think much is happening. And I think what's really...
Even with mega cities, for example?
So you have partnerships between certain actors, and the UN's quite a good facilitator of those. But I don't think there is oversight or strategy for dealing and looking comprehensively at the good and the bad of technology. So we have, one group of experts will be looking at lethal autonomous weapons. Maybe one agency will be looking at the question of will robots replace the workforce or whatever. But internet governance is it doesn't sit well at the moment in any agency. And as much as I've said the answer is not to create a new agency, sometimes I do wonder whether this is one area where actually a holistic view would be good. Right at the back there.
I'm very quiet.
Thank you very much for that. My name is Emma, I'm from Scotland, and the policy idea that I was really interested in was DFID's 2017 economic policy, which is increasing public-private partnerships in international development context. So I just thought, as we're talking about the UN, one area, it's more of a comment than a question, one area that the UN has really excelled in is in international dispute resolution. So I'm currently studying international commercial law and arbitration, and UNCITRAL put together a really good model law that's been very effective around the world.
I think that's really interesting, and that's I think that's really the other half of the UN stepping back from development, is then to focus on the things that it can really do well. And at the moment, it's not able to do that because the vast majority of UN staff, 50,000 of 70, 80,000, are working and doing work on the ground that I think other actors could do, probably could do better. So yeah, that's really interesting. We haven't looked at that per se. I will take that back to colleagues. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for your time, Natalie. My name is Maria. I'm from Casablanca, Morocco. I'm interested in learning more about the UN association. Like, other than the UN and governments. Thanks. I'm interested in learning more about the UN association. Other than the UN and governments, who are the other main stakeholders of the association and how do you engage with them? And one side question is, where do your revenues come from? Thanks.
I don't think we have many revenues at the moment. So we are independent from the government and from the UN. And we get no money from the government or from the UN, which is not always nice when I look at my bottom line, but it is good because it means we can be truly independent. We do work with both of them, sometimes on projects. So, for example, some of our events, we had an event in May where we brought the Secretary General to London for his first big speech. That was an example of a partnership. But for the most part, we are funded by our own members. So we are an association. So we have ordinary people, young professionals networks, organizations. So an organizational member could be a school, a university, it could be a business, etc. And they pay a standard fee. And that's how we are financed. And then we try to work with them, sometimes generically. So we might just say, we have a campaign we will want you to support. And other times we will pick particular partners to work on issues. So at the moment, we're really interested in the role of investors in climate change. I was just interested in the comments on the divestment discussion before. So we are looking for who within our network has good links. Who can we talk to? How can we arrange some meetings and sort of put people in contact? So because there's not a big UN agency presence in London, there's only the International Maritime Headquarters, which deals with very specific sort of law of the sea issues. We tend to be the focal point for all things UN. So we will get a small or a big company call us up and want to meet to talk about their investment policy, or say, we want to align our corporate social responsibility with the SDGs. How do we do that? Or we want to make a submission to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. An NGO might ask us about that process. We'll give advice. So that's sort of what we do. We are a facilitator, we are a convener, and then, as I've already said, on certain issues, we are a campaigner. And I would say about half that time is spent lobbying the UK government to do a better job and live up to its international obligations. So we've just produced something called the Foreign Policy Scorecard, which looks at the UK's performance on human rights, disarmament, climate change, development, and so on. And then the other half of the time, we are focused on making the UN work better. So now that we've finished our work on the selection process, we're looking at appointments more broadly within the system. We're looking at issues surrounding whistleblowing. That's something we're going to start. And we're also looking at sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers, which is an issue that I think is in the top 3 criticisms of the UN whenever I go and give a talk somewhere. And we think the UN has not done enough, but it's got somewhere. And now actually it's time for states also to match that progress by, well, actually prosecuting people who are accused of these horrible crimes. So that's sort of a flavor of what we do.
Okay, sorry. My name is Dotun, and my policy interest is in creating fair markets and food distribution systems for smallholder farmers. One of the biggest challenges in food security now is you find out that the FAO index shows that food supply, food production in the last 12 years has been consistently higher than food demand. That's what people can consume, but then we still have hunger, and we still have people, suffering from, not getting access to food. So the question is, where is the food? If we are producing more than we should consume, we should ask questions. So I want to find out, what is UN doing about this? What's the agenda around food security? Because from the statistics that is out there right now, we are about to, the SDG, the SDG that was set out recently is that by 2030 we should end hunger and poverty, but as it stands now, we are about to miss that projection. My second question is on, now there's a wave of countries in Europe talking about reducing consumption of fossil fuels and moving away from into more cleaner fuels. So that means that there are developing countries who rely on revenues from crude oil are going to find it very difficult to run government, to run institutions in the next 20 years. So is there any plan by United Nations to provide some form of advising for these countries? How do they sustain government after we stop consuming fossil fuels? Where would they generate revenue from?
2 questions that I'm not really an expert on, if I'm honest. I'm not an expert at all on issues of food security and distribution. We did a little bit of work just publicizing a report which maybe answers a little bit your question on what happens to all the food. A third of it is wasted. And in rich countries, that waste happens at the user level. So it's people buying too much and throwing it away, quite frankly, and shop stocking too much, and sell by dates that we're scared of, selling things because people might sue us if they get ill, but actually the food is good. So, here in this country and others, we chuck things away. In developing countries, it's an issue that food waste occurs usually at the production level. So it's not good storage, etc. Transportation. Those are the kinds of issues. I don't know what's new at the moment and what's happening in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, but if you give me your details, I can connect you with someone in the World Food Programme and in the FAO who might be able to answer your question. It's not something, as I said, I'm an expert on. In terms of fossil fuels, I'm half Sri Lankan, half Austrian. I have a lot of sympathy with this sort of, oh well, we did this, we got rich and successful and have comfortable lives as a result of fossil fuels and industrial policy, but you guys can't have it over there because now, we're in hot water with climate change. But there are plans to make sure that economies diversify, because that is ultimately a problem. Regardless of the climate change issue, if your economy is reliant on 1 or 2 sources of income, it is not a strong economy and not a resilient economy. What the UN is doing, there's a host of initiatives. Again, I can send you some information about that. But there's a fund that's supposed to help developing countries institute the kind of economic changes that they need to make to ensure that they're no longer reliant on fossil fuels. And actually, some of the best examples of leadership are from African and Asian, Latin American countries. So I don't think it's a one-way process. I think that a lot of Western countries could learn from some of the amazing initiatives on solar energy, for example, that are coming from the developing world. But again, it's not an area that is particularly my expertise, but I can connect you with people who can give you a much better answer. Sorry. Should we take a couple at a time, actually, and try and get through a few?
Thank you. My name is Miguel. I understand that the United Nations goes as far as the members states want it to go. But also, I'm of the idea that the SG, as the leader of an organization, can make something to set an internal agenda of the United Nations, of the Secretariat, if you want to see it like that, to move forward certain issues in the agenda. In this sense, my question is, what leadership traits or skills should the current or coming SGs have that the previous SGs didn't have to overcome the challenges that the UN as an organization has right now? And I developed like what are the leadership traits and skills that the next SG must have that the previous didn't?
Should we take your question as well, actually, then I can try and get through.
So Jack from Wales. As someone that actually had a question asked by the permanent representative of the UK to Secretary General during the 1.7 billion campaign, I must say it's a success. And I was glad to hear that you're still looking at selection processes. So as we discussed earlier about my research, many states I met were questioning about whether there was still going to be this drive for change. But my comment is that you talked about that we must be, we can look at reform ideas, but we must put political action into it. So why do we still see massive amounts of barriers to the ECOSOC NGO Committee for Civil Society Groups, specifically in human rights and in certain areas, even though it's quite a political issue and many states are being urged to support it?
Right. Is there any... Always keep an eye out for women, sorry.
Hi, I'm Kamil Majid from Pakistan, and I've got 4 questions actually.
Okay. Are they quick and easy?
They're not
then you
really
can have
easy,
it. Okay.
Unfortunately. So the SDGs. So I wanted a consultant for the SDGs, for localizing SDGs in Pakistan as well. And you know, the developing countries are facing a lot of issues with regards to that. The first one is that the SDGs are considered as good development goals as well sometimes, because of the fact that they're very ambitious in nature, right? So a lot of people consider them as rather as a wish list and as utopian promises. When you consider goal number 1, which is eliminate all forms of poverty by 2030, which my friend rightly pointed out seems very difficult to achieve. So you just think of eliminating like poverty completely. So the first is basically, do you think the SDGs are very ambitious in nature? The second one is that this is a basic economic problem in the developing countries, that the resources are scarce and the needs are pretty much unlimited. So you need to make the best of all of the resources that you have. But with reference to the SDGs, I get this feeling that all of the SDGs, there's no prioritization as such. It feels as if that all of the SDGs are a priority. But the problem is that there's 17 goals with 169 targets. And when you're sitting in these meetings, nobody has any idea whatsoever to what to do with like 169 targets. It gets very, very complicated. So that's the second question. The third question is that, don't you believe that SDGs are rather a to-do list and you're giving a set of targets to all these developing countries to achieve, while you're ignoring the complex structures in the developing countries and ignoring the fact that perhaps SDG goal number 1, which is poverty, is somehow in some way related to SDG goal 4, which is quality education. Because if poverty is going to prevail, it's going to be very difficult to educate the population, which will always consider education as rather a luxury because they don't have the basic necessities of life, right? And similarly, the same thing goes with health as well. A well-educated society is going to consider the health considerations and all those things as well. So that's question number 3. Question number 4 is: do you consider the UN as an implementation organization? So do you think UN has a role to play in policies, but does the UN as an organization has a role to play in practices as well, in implementation of practices on ground? Thanks so much.
Okay, that's a nice mix to end with. In terms of the Secretary General, his or her power and traits, it's not called the sort of world's most impossible job for nothing. I think the Secretary General works within huge constraints of the Charter, the political constraints, the fact that she or he has to keep both the powerful on side, but also make sure that he or she has enough support for the wider agenda. So I think it's a balancing act. I think the most important trait that some have had in the past, and I hope this Secretary General has, and I think he does, is knowing when to speak out and when not to speak out. You can't be the moral voice that my Secretary General when I was growing up was Kofi Annan, hugely inspiring, everyone knows him. We polled people actually 3 years ago and said, who is the Secretary General? And most people said Kofi Annan. So maybe there's a point there about, I think Mr. Ban's brilliant actually, but there's a point there to be made that he didn't use his voice in the same way. Or actually, he didn't at the beginning, then he tried to, and he used it all the time. He was saying everything was awful all the time, and that just doesn't cut through anymore. It doesn't work with the modern media. So this Secretary General has come under fire already for not speaking out on certain issues, but I think that's a skill in itself. But that said, he or she needs to define what their red lines is. So the Secretary General should always, in my view, speak out about mass atrocities, genocide, the worst abuses. So there has to be that bottom line. And then use the rest of the time to do political mediation, behind the scenes work, so that, quite frankly, we don't hear about what he or she is doing because they're solving issues. I think mediation, that political tact and nous, and knowing when to speak out. And when you do speak out, be powerful, be clear, be inspiring. Make sure you can set a long-term vision and talk about issues such as inequality and lack of solidarity and the democratic deficit at the UN and all this sort of hard, difficult stuff that governments don't want to do. You need to be able to do that, but you also need to be able to dial it down, disappear, and go into a room with a few people and hopefully solve a conflict. ECOSOC, yes, horrible. The NGO appointment process is terrible, and actually that is an area where a better process might help, but ultimately it's just hugely political. It's sad that process rests amongst member states, I don't think they're going to give up that power. It would be much better to have independent experts, UN rapporteurs, a collection of them come and make those decisions. I love that. That is it's always worth pushing a proposal. I didn't mean to do down UN reform proposals. We need them. We need the big ideas, I think, and that comes up to your question. But I don't think it's going to happen in that case. Yes, the SDGs are huge. I think part of the reason why they're huge is because you need to have a big goal if you're going to make incremental steps. The second reason I think they're huge is because we had a consultation process. The Millennium Development Goals were, and I know this, it was like, oh, oops, we mentioned them in a report. The head of UNDP at the time, the Deputy Secretary General at the time, he was head of UNDP, Mark Malloch-Brown, him and a few colleagues, literally in a room scribbling on the back of a letter, 8 goals. The only reason the environment goal was included is because they happened to bump into the UN Environment Programme head in the corridor. And they said, oh, oops, we better have something on the environment in there. So that was a top-down process. Huge complaints. So instead you had consultation upon consultation upon consultation, public surveys, online surveys, regional groups, And what do you have when you ask people what they want? They all want different things. That's why you get 17 goals and 169 targets. I remember speaking to people, can we not as an NGO group come up with a few 10 priorities? No, what about this issue, that issue, this issue? So I think that's why they're so ambitious. It's not necessarily a problem, because your second question, prioritization, that needs to come from government at the national level, and more importantly, in my view, from local communities. Not all goals are going to be relevant all the time or equally important. And it's not passing the buck, but I think it would be wrong for a bunch of officials or states or whatever, and actually, in fact, wrong for a government to set an agenda without it coming from people. The third thing, is it a to-do list? It's a to-do list for everyone. So, they're not the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They're not goals for developing countries. They're goals for everyone. And it's annoying that rich countries don't understand that this means they need to do stuff too. It's not just about, oh, we'll give aid and tell other countries what to do with it. This is about the UK and other rich countries trying to work on their own gender equality problems, their own education problems, their own problems of inequality, their own problems of sustainable consumption. There are a bunch of NGOs at the moment working on that here, a bunch of parliamentarians working on that here. I don't think the message is really resonating in other capitals, but there's some really interesting stuff happening at the moment. There's an event next week in Georgia, which is looking at their open government platform, and they went from being one of the most corrupt countries to one of the best countries to do business with as a result of the sort of e-platform where a citizen can manage all of their services online themselves. You don't have to pay anyone or see anyone. There's a lot we can learn in these countries, in this country and other countries like it, from those sorts of examples. Is the UN an implementation tool? Yes, and I think too much at the moment. I do think it needs to be actors on the ground who do most of that work. I don't think it's sustainable for the UN to keep doing that. I think the UN needs to focus on complex emergencies where you need the expertise, you need the firepower, you need a surge of humanitarian, assistance. It needs to focus on things like mediation, thought leadership, research, the things that it does really well, dispute resolution. We had, there are lots of things that the UN does better or doesn't do that well, but others are not that, well placed to do it. So it'd be great if it stepped back from some of its implementation and focused on those areas where it could make the biggest impact. That's actually quite a controversial thing to say. It's not something that a lot of people agree with, but more and more voices are saying that now. I think that's it, isn't it?
Yeah,
yes.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for coming. It's really